This is one of the favorite things that I do. This is called the Toolbox. Let me explain a little bit about it. I have literally done hundreds, no exaggeration, hundreds if not thousands of presentations on special education discipline over the 40 years that I've been doing this. It continues to be the most complicated area of the law that I've bumped into. So if you find yourself confused about special ed discipline, don't blame yourself. The law is confusing. And I noticed on the program for this legal conference, there's a whole slew of presentations on the same topic. And that's because it's of such critical importance and it's hard to figure out. So several years ago, I sat down and I made an intentional effort to try to make it simpler and to try to put it into a vocabulary and a framework that would help me talk about it, teach about it, and people to understand it in a little bit easier way. And I have now been doing Toolbox workshops for many years. I've done this many times in Texas. It's a full-day workshop, so what you're going to get in the next hour and a half is an overview of what takes all day. So we'll do our best on that. We should have, I think we'll have time for a little Q&A as we go along. We'll see how that works. So that's what it's about. And in a lot of respects, what I want to say also by way of introduction is you're not going to hear anything new here. The law has not changed. You're going to hear change of placement. You're going to hear 10 days. You're going to hear behavior intervention plan. You're going to hear manifestation determination. Nothing's changed. What I did with the Toolbox is I tried to repackage it in a way that was easier for me to understand it and therefore easier for you to understand it. So that's what the Toolbox is all about. Let me go ahead and get started with the PowerPoint here. This is a quote from a weird case that went to the Supreme Court. And some of you I'm sure some of you have heard of this case. It got a lot of attention because it was such a bizarre fact situation. It had nothing to do with special ed. It's called the Bong hits for Jesus case. And some of you may have heard this. Here's what happened. The Olympic torch was on its way from Japan to Salt Lake City. You remember when Salt Lake City had the Winter Olympics? So the Olympic torch is being relayed one person at a time, and it's going through Juneau, Alaska. And it's a big deal in Juneau, Alaska. The whole town shows up for this. The Olympic torch is coming through. The TV cameras are there for the evening news. And a group of kids at the high school decide that this is a great opportunity for them to get on television. Now, what do we need to do to get on television? Well, we got to do something that stands out. So they hold up this 15-foot banner that says Bong hits for Jesus. And they didn't spell the word for, they used the number. You know, I'd have suspended him from school based on that. And if that had happened, we wouldn't be where we are. But the principal thought that this was disrespectful, and she jerked the banner down from them and she suspended him from school. And these kids took this all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's a free speech case. And they lost. And that's not what's important here today. But Justice Alito wrote the opinion, and he made these observations which are kind of weird because there was nothing dangerous about the 15-foot banner that said Bong hits for Jesus. This is just an attention-getting prank by a group of high school kids who want to get on television. But he says school attendance can expose students to threats to their physical safety that they would not otherwise face. He says students may be compelled every day to spend time at close quarters with other students who may do them harm. Experience shows that schools can be places of special danger. Now, why is he saying all this? This case, nobody was endangered. He's saying this to justify giving the benefit of the doubt to that principal who has to make a snap judgment. That's the logic behind this. He's saying, look, that principal is responsible for student safety, and that principal encounters all sorts of weird things, and let's not us judges be second-guessing that principal. Well, hello. Don't you love it when you come in late and you have to come in the front of the room? So, yeah, well, I take advantage of every opportunity to liven things up, you know. Okay. All right. So he's just trying to justify, you know, why we really ought to give the benefit of the doubt to the principal. So that's a 2007 case, Frederick versus Morse. Now here's the dilemma that we're here to talk about. Our special ed laws impose two requirements on you all, and we expect you to do both of them, and that's what's hard. If we told you tomorrow you can choose one of these and forget the other, life would be a lot simpler. But we tell you, number one, you have a duty to provide an appropriate education to every student, regardless of the student's behavior. You know, there's no such thing as expulsion of the special education student. There isn't. When I first started practicing school law, there were kids who engaged in certain types of behavior and they were kicked out for a long time. No questions asked. If the student's in your special ed program, that is simply not an option. Regardless of what the student does and regardless of whether it has anything to do with their disability, they have a right to an appropriate education. And by the way, and where are we supposed to serve them? In the least restrictive environment. So not only do you have a duty to serve kids who sometimes do dangerous things, you have to serve them in the least restrictive environment. So that's one obligation. Now here's your other obligation. You have to maintain a safe and orderly campus, don't you? I'll bet your parents would rank that one number one. You know, I want my child to learn something at school today, but even more than that, I want my child to come home from school today safe, not traumatized by something that happened. So we tell schools you got to do these two things and you got to do them at the same time. And your authority is constrained. Now I think that's the right word, constrained. Do we have campus principals here? Raise your hand if you're a campus principal. Okay, assistant principals? Okay. Who are the rest of you people? We have special ed types, right? Yeah, we have the parent network, I understand. Okay. The target audience for the Toolbox is the campus principal and the special ed staff. I want them all to hear the same thing at the same time, and they're the ones that have to make this work. But your authority, when I say authority of school officials, I really mean the principal. The principal's authority is constrained. I never like to hear a principal say, our hands are tied by the law. They're not tied, they are restricted. Constrained is probably the right word. So we've had our special ed laws since 1975. That's 44 years now. We have only had one case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court that had to do with special ed discipline. One case. It's the Doe family again. I told you about them. It's Hony versus Doe. And this is a case from San Francisco, California. And let me tell you what happened. It was two high school boys, 16, I think they were both about 16 years old. They're both identified as having emotional disturbances. They're both engaging in dangerous, disruptive behaviors. And everybody agrees that their behaviors are a manifestation of their disability. So you got that? We've got ED kids acting ED. And everybody says, well, you know, that's part of their disability, but they're dangerous. What are we going to do? So the San Francisco school officials called for a change of placement, a long-term removal to an alternative program of some sort, and the parents objected, and the parents requested a due process hearing. Now, question for you all. School proposes a change of placement, parents challenge it with a due process hearing. What happens to the student? Stay put. Very good. You know that term. Stay put. So the parents requested a hearing and they said, okay, stay put. And the school district said, nope, not this time. We don't think stay put applies. Well, why not? Because they're dangerous. You know, if this was a little girl with a hearing impairment and we were just talking about the best place to serve her, then yes, stay put. These are dangerous kids. Somebody's going to get hurt. We're not okay with stay put. We're not going to honor it. We don't think it applies. Well, that was the issue that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Here's what the court said. We think it's clear that Congress very much meant to, knew what they were doing, did it on purpose, meant to strip, pretty strong word there, strip the school of the unilateral authority that they have traditionally employed to exclude disabled students, particularly ED kids. That's a pretty strong statement. What they said to the school district's lawyers from San Francisco, they said, you're asking us to read something into the law that's not there, counsel. You think the law should say stay put unless dangerous. It doesn't say that. It says stay put. There's a period after that. So you lose. And now, if do you have copies of these slides? you should circle or underline the word unilateral, because that's important. The court is saying it's the unilateral power that's taken away, because that's exactly what the superintendent was trying to do. The superintendent of the schools in San Francisco unilaterally ordered the removal of these boys. He didn't get anybody else's approval. Unilateral. And the court said, you don't have that kind of power anymore. Now, in this very same case, the court gave its approval to what we now call the 10-day rule. And so the message to principals is, you have unilateral power for exactly 10 days during the school year. Anything that goes beyond that, your authority to act unilaterally has been stripped away from you, and they did it on purpose. Now, that was 1988. They have changed it some. The law has changed some since then. That unilateral power has been restored in some cases, and we'll talk about that when we talk about tool number 5. But that's our starting point, is that you're asked to do two things at the same time, and your authority is constrained, and your unilateral power has been taken away from you. So, how you resolve the tension. Now, do we have classroom teachers here, by the way? Do we have any class? No, they're in the classroom today, aren't they? School just started. My earlier group, I had 2 classroom teachers. They're like, what are you doing here? School, Anyway, when I talk about this stuff to classroom teachers and it's Q&A time, I know what's coming. I know what's coming. I'll do a 45-minute presentation on special ed discipline, and then does anybody have any questions? Well, here it comes. Well, I teach the 5th grade, and I have 22 students in my classroom. I don't really think of them as 22 students. I think of them as 21 students, and then there's Jacob. All right, now do y'all know where the rest of this story goes? I think some of you have probably heard this before. I don't have 22, I got 21, and then there's Jacob. Jacob is the one I'm worrying about on my way to school every day. Jacob is the one that's got me thinking maybe it's not too late for me to go to law school. Jacob is the one I'm getting emails and phone calls from the other parents about. And so she lays this predicate, and here comes the question that I know is coming. The question is, don't the other kids have any rights? Did y'all ever hear that from your teachers? I don't think that teacher's uncompassionate. I don't think that teacher is saying Jacob shouldn't have his rights, but she's in that classroom seeing the impact that Jacob has on the other group of kids, and she asks a very logical question. Okay, you've just been telling me about Jacob's rights. Don't the other kids have any rights? And my answer is, well, of course they have rights. And then I go on to explain about IEP teams and stuff like that, and I lose the teacher. She doesn't find that very satisfying. She wants a simpler answer. But the answer is, here's the answer, don't the other kids have any rights? The tension between your competing duties is restored by the IEP team, or what you call the case conference committee. So what I tell that teacher is, if you think Jacob doesn't belong in your classroom, you need to have some influence the next time the case conference committee meets. Your principal does not have the unilateral power to change this for you. Your special ed director cannot change this, even if she would like to. The only group that can make a change here is the case conference committee. So let's see if you can have some influence on how that group makes its decision the next time. So that's how the tension is resolved. IEP teams all the time are balancing out, we want to serve this student, even though this student sometimes engages in dangerous behavior. We want to have a safe school for everybody. We want to recognize the rights of all the other kids. How do we balance that? And we make a case-by-case decision. But there are tools in the toolbox, so let's get to the tools. Now there's 10 of them, and I'll just put them all up here right now. And I chose 10 on purpose. I created this thing. I could have gone with 7. It's kind of how you slice and dice. We could have had 13, but everybody likes 10. Moses came down the mountain from 10, you'll recall. There's 10 in the Bill of Rights. How many teams are in the Big 12? Do you know? 10. But it's the Big 12. How many teams are in the Big 10? 14. 14. But they're hanging on to Big 10 because everybody likes 10. So we're going with 10. Now, if you have your copies, here's what I'd encourage you to do. Number 1, draw something to distinguish tool number 1 from all the rest. Tool number 1 is different from all the rest. Tool number 1, that's a behavior intervention plan. That is the only tool that is specifically designed to improve the student's behavior. The rest of them are more about managing the student's behavior. Tool number 1 is about improving the student's behavior. It's your most important tool. If tool number 1 works, you can put the toolbox away. So tool number 1 is very important. The other place you might want to draw a line is between 5 and 6. Draw something that distinguishes between 5 and 6. These first 5 can all be used when the behavior is a manifestation of disability. So you have a student with autism. We have an evaluation report that tells us that we can expect the following types of behavior. And that's exactly what we see day in and day out. These are behaviors that are a manifestation of the student's autism. You're not powerless. You've got tools 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 that can be done. Tool 6, since it is a disciplinary change of placement, is limited to behavior that is not a manifestation of disability. Okay? Now, a couple other things about the wording of some of these. You'll notice 3 of them are changes of placement. 2, 3, and 6 are changes of placement. And since it's a change of placement, and by the way, Julie's talking about this tomorrow, right? Isn't that her general session? And I looked at her materials, and it's very consistent with what I'm saying. If it's more than 10 days in a row, it's a change of placement. So there's 2 ways to do that, or there's 3. You can do an educational, you can do a discipline. What's the difference? The difference is the manifestation determination. This is punitive. This is the same kind of consequence that the non-disabled student would have for misbehavior. So it's a disciplinary change. So we're not going to do this unless the case conference committee says that that behavior was not a manifestation of disability. Okay? But these 2 are educational. So I don't have 22 students in my classroom. I have 21, and then there's Jacob. Let's suppose we have a case conference committee to consider Jacob's placement. And everybody agrees that Jacob's behavior is really out of control. We also agree that it's a manifestation of his disability. We don't want to punish him for it. We can't punish him for it. But we could have a change of placement for educational reasons. And that's what tools 2 and 3 accomplish. And you can see the difference is tool 2 is done the easy way. Everybody agrees. And tool 3 is done the hard way because we have a disagreement with the parent about it. So those are the 10 tools, and so let's dive into these. And if you don't know what FAPE-free zone is, we'll get to that. All right. So here we go. So BIPs. So I just had a whole session on BIPs. Here's the thing about behavior plans, and I understand that Indiana has kind of a template for this. Is that right? You guys have a form that everybody's using statewide? Well, good for you. There is nothing federally for this. There is no definition of what a behavior plan is, but there is a description of it. And I think the description is important. It's positive behavior strategies and supports. It's what we do for the student, not what we do to the student. You have another document that says what you do to the student. It's called the Code of Conduct. And the Code of Conduct is full of all sorts of negative consequences. The Code of Conduct is where your principals get the authority to order an out-of-school suspension. Do you all ever do that? Out-of-school suspension for a few days? In-school suspension? Do you do that? Suspension from the bus? Removal from extracurricular activities? After-school detention? Do you do that? So that's all in your Code of Conduct. And so all of that is what we do to the student. The BIP is what we do for the student, okay? So I told this story to the group that was here for BIPs, and there may be some of you that were here for that, but I'm going to tell the story again because it's just a good one, about how nobody reads the Code of Conduct until some student does something that's so creative that we don't know how to classify it. And we had a situation in Texas last year where a kid got hold of his dad's credit card and contacted Strippers Are Us or whatever, exotic dancers who entertain. And so he contacted this lady, and she was told to report to such and such an address. It didn't say that it was the middle school. And so she's working the early morning shift. She's got this at 9 o'clock. She gets the dispatch on her cell phone that she's to report to such and such an address, so she does. And she becomes the hero of the story because she shows up and she sees, oh my God, it's a middle school. This is a prank. And so she could have turned around and gone home. She didn't. She goes into the school and reports to the assistant principal. She said, I'm Destiny or Misty or whatever, and I was sent here to entertain you, and I don't really think you did that. I am available later tonight if you're interested, but I was sent here, and here's the credit card that authorized me to come here, and so they traced it back to the kid. Does your code of conduct reference, thou shalt not call a stripper? I don't think so. But it's a violation, right? I mean, that's wrong, right? So that's your code of conduct. And your code of conduct describes what we're going to do to the student, not what we're going to do for the student. So I put a lot of emphasis on the behavior plan being proactive, individualized, focus on an identified behavior, and I think you have to have parental agreement on your behavior plan. Which is, so I want to suggest some things. Let's see. Now we'll go to that in a second. Now, let me put this in context. There's very little requirements with regard to a BIP. The law does say a couple of times when we have to do one. But most of the time when you guys are writing a BIP, it's not when you have to, it's when you think it's a good idea. And you have a lot of discretion as far as what goes into that. But here's some ideas that I have. I am not in favor of putting, I'll give you 3 categories of negative things that I do not think belong in the code of conduct. Number 1 is call the cops. I actually had I had a call from a school district. A lot of what I think comes from experience from a phone call I had. I had a call from a school district. They said, we're trying to come up to agreement with the parents on the behavior plan, and they will absolutely not allow us to call the police. I said, well, you don't need the parents' consent to call the police. If the student has committed a criminal offense, or you think that the student has committed a criminal, you have the authority to do that. Well, we're trying to put it in the BIP. And I said, well, don't put it in the BIP. Put it in the code of conduct where it belongs. So, why invite an argument that you don't need to have? So call the police. Number 2, short-term disciplinary consequences. Remember, the Supreme Court said, principals, your unilateral power has been taken away from you except for those 10 days. So you have that authority, principals. So you don't need to be putting that into a BIP. It's in the code of conduct already. So you have the authority to order a 3-day out-of-school suspension, and I wouldn't put that in a BIP. It's not a positive behavior intervention anyway. It's just a management tool. So, and the third thing I would not put into the BIP is physical restraint. Now, Indiana, I think like all other states, has some rules and regulations pertaining to the use of physical restraint. I didn't study them, but I'm pretty confident of something. Your physical restraint authority is limited to genuine emergencies. Am I right about that? Well, if that's the case, you don't put that in a BIP. That's not a positive behavior intervention. It's a response to an immediate need for physical intervention. My shorthand explanation of when physical restraint is permissible, it's when it's needed to prevent greater harm. If I see a student who looks like they are about to attack another student with a baseball bat, and the only way to prevent this for sure is to physically intervene, I can physically intervene. In fact, I would suggest I probably have to physically intervene. So these don't belong in a BIP. These are not positive behavior interventions. These are things we hope we don't have to use. But we do have the authority to use them. And so the BIP is something else. So here's my summary of the differences between the BIP and the code of conduct. BIP's positive, the code's negative. The BIP is proactive, the code is reactive. The BIP applies to one, the code applies to all. The BIP is agreed to with the parent. The code is not, it's imposed by the school. So we have consent from the parent for what we're going to do on a BIP. On the code we have notice to the parent but not consent. So in a nutshell, it's what we do for rather than what we do to. Okay? So here's some things I just mentioned. Should the interventions include short-term removals? I would suggest not. That's not a positive behavior intervention. And you already have the authority to do that. What about physical restraint? You're going to get some requests from parents who will ask you to promise never to use physical restraint. And I think, I'm very sympathetic to the people who ask for that. A lot of times these are kids in foster care, and they have been abused by a lot of authority figures. I get it. And their foster parents, their guardians, their caretakers are going to say, would you please promise that you'll never use any kind of hands-on technique with this child? I think we ought to promise that to the extent that we can. But what are you going to do if there's a school shooter? What are you going to do if there's an imminent emergency? So, and the other thing, make sure that everybody understands the code of conduct applies to everybody. The BIP is not my personalized code of conduct. So, I used to hear people say, oh, he's not subject to the code of conduct anymore. We wrote a BIP. I said, well, that's not what a BIP is about. The more proper thing to say is everybody is subject to the code of conduct. The BIP is designed to help the student comply with it. So we're going to provide positive, proactive services to prevent recurrence of the behavior. So I'm telling you what I think. And again, let me go back and say, there's not much law with regard to exactly what a BIP is supposed to have. So, this is just one lawyer's perspective. But I'm in favor of using a BIP pretty much exclusively for proactive teaching appropriate behaviors rather than responding to bad behaviors. You've got stuff that's there to respond to bad behaviors. One other thing I'll say about this, and then we'll move on. If you write a BIP, and I've seen BIPs written sometimes that have a very detailed protocol for exactly how the school will respond to student misconduct. My experience as a lawyer is that's a mistake. Number one, I don't think those are really the kind of proactive, positive behavior intervention strategies and supports that we're supposed to do. But the other thing is, just from a pure legal point of view, if you lay out a detailed protocol for we're going to do this, and you lay out 5 things that we will do when the student misbehaves, you're not going to comply with it. I can confidently predict that. In the heat of a moment, somebody's not going to know what it says, or somebody's going to forget it, or whatever. You're not going to do it. And the easiest way for a school to create a legal problem for itself is to say it's going to do something and then don't do it. So we want to be kind of careful about that, okay? So what do you need to use tool 1? You need current evaluation data. Do you have to have a functional behavioral assessment? Not necessarily. You have to have adequate evaluation data to support what's the problematic behavior, what do we think will be an effective intervention support strategy to reteach about that. Schools usually do a functional behavioral assessment, but you have to, so the way I word it is you have to have that or the equivalent. Let's review the student's disciplinary history. Let's get input from everybody, parents and teachers. Let's get agreement of the IEP team, or the CCC as you call it. In Texas we call them ARDs. I mentioned that, didn't I? Hard ARDs and all that. So you got CCCs. I kind of like that. I may be used to that by tomorrow. Here's tool number 2. Now we're going to talk about a change of placement. And this one is done with agreement. And it's an educational change of placement. So now we're talking about, let's go back to my example of, I don't have 22 students anymore. I've got 21. And then there's Jacob. Jacob's in our special ed program. Jacob has an IEP. Jacob has a BIP. The teacher reports to us, I just don't think we can provide the level of support that Jacob needs in the mainstream classroom where he currently is. I think we ought to think about a change to a more restrictive environment. We have a CCC meeting, and the parents are in total agreement with this, okay? We sing Kumbaya at the end of it, and the parent promises to bring cupcakes to the next meeting. You're not calling the lawyer on that one. And that's an educational change of placement. Now, here's what the regulations say about this. If we pull the IEP team together for purposes of making a manifestation, now let's think about that. You wouldn't do that unless the student's done something pretty serious, right? So we don't have manifestation determinations unless the student has done something that is serious enough that we would consider a long-term removal to some place. So we're making a manifestation, and the team comes to consensus that the behavior that we're talking about is a manifestation of disability. The regulations tell us exactly what to do with that student. It says the student is to be returned to the placement from which the student was removed. So notice the assumption in the regulation is that the principal did order the removal of the child, but just for a few days until we have our CCC meeting. And then we had our meeting, and the team says, well, you know what? That behavior is a manifestation of disability. Okay, right back to where they were before. There's two exceptions. The first exception is special circumstances. And in the toolbox, we call that tool number 5. So we'll get to that one in a little bit. So that's now an exception. If it involves special circumstances, the student is not to be returned to where she was. The student goes somewhere else. We'll talk about that when we talk about Tool 5. But here's the second exception. Unless the parent and the LEA, that's a local education agency, agree to a change of placement as part of the modification of the BIP. Now you notice I put quotes around that. I didn't want to paraphrase this. I wanted to show you exactly what the regulation says. So the student would normally be returned to where he was unless we all agree. So I'll go back to Jacob. We're having a manifestation meeting because he's done something pretty bad, and everybody says it's a manifestation of his disability. This says, well, then send him right back to the regular classroom where he was, unless you have special circumstances. Well, we don't. Well then, what about this? If the parent and the school agree to a change of placement, that can be done, okay? And that's what I call tool number 2. That's a change of placement based on behavior that is a manifestation of disability, and it's done with parental agreement. Now I want you to carefully read it. Agree to a change of placement as part of the modification of the BIP. So you notice what that assumes? We change the BIP first, and then based on changes to the BIP, we change the placement. So we don't come into this meeting and say, I think Jacob needs to go to the whatever. No, we say, let's take a look at Jacob's BIP. It's not working as well as we would like. If the BIP was working as well as we would like, we wouldn't be having this case conference committee today. So the BIP is not working as well as we would like. I think we need to change the behavior plan. Parents in agreement. All right, we make changes to the behavior plan, and based on that we say, well, you know, in order to implement that, we may need to go to a more restrictive setting. And so that's tool number 2. It's not a disciplinary removal. This comes directly from the federal government. They were asked, does this have to be classified as a disciplinary removal? And they said no, even though it is based on a violation of the code of conduct. You notice how that's worded? When the parents and the school are in agreement, after the child has violated the code of conduct, is this a disciplinary removal? And they say no, not when it's agreed to. So that's tool number 2, okay? Now notice they're talking about agree to a change of placement as part of the modification of the BIP. So if I'm the leader of this meeting and I'm thinking, you know, this might be a place where we use tool number 2, I'm going to go into that meeting talking about the BIP and talking about maybe we need to make a change in that, okay? So what do you need? Due process for the student, which would include the manifestation meeting, IEP team meeting, prior written notice, documenting parental agreement. And you know, on this type of thing, I don't think the parent just checking a yes box at the end of a lengthy IEP document is enough. I'd want more robust indication of parental agreement on this change of placement, because this is a little unusual. We're moving a student to a more restrictive environment for behavior that's a manifestation of disability. We might not normally do that, but we can do it with parental agreement, okay? So that's tool number 2, okay? I asked somebody here, one of the people with the IEP Resource Center, about if we have any kind of statewide, well-established alternative programs here in Indiana that every school district has access to, and I was told no. In other words, what I was questioning was, when you have a student who can be properly removed from the regular school due to discipline problems, how do you continue to provide a free, appropriate public education? And I was told it's kind of all over the map. One thing Texas has done well, there's a lot of things we've done not so well in special education, but one thing Texas has done very well, and it goes back a long time. In 1995, our state legislature mandated that every school district had to offer what's now called a DAEP, a Disciplinary Alternative Education Program. And this was not just for special ed kids. This is for any kid who committed an offense that might previously call for expulsion to the street. We put them in a DAEP. That's mandated. So every school district has one. Some of them are real good, some of them are pretty good, some of them are okay, but everybody has one. I have to tell you, I'm not sure how other states comply with our federal special ed law without having something like that. Because when we start talking about removing the student, you still have to put them someplace where they continue to receive an appropriate education. So, I would encourage you all to work toward creating real alternative programs with certified teachers, with special education staff, with a full day program, that type of thing. Costly, yes. But in order to provide the type of services that kids need, I think you need to think about that. So let me go on to tool number 3, and then after that we'll pause again and see if you all have some questions. Now this is very similar to tool number 2. There's just one big difference. What is it? We're calling the lawyer on this one because this time we're in a fight. Parents don't agree. So what do? So let's start with this. You always have the option of proposing a change of placement to a more restrictive environment. Let's call that an MRE. That's a military term. Do you know what they call that? Meals ready to eat. But it also could be the more restrictive environment. The school can always propose a move to a more restrictive environment. And it should be done only if the disability causes the misbehavior. Think about that. Everybody's supposed to be in the same regular classroom that everybody's in. The only reason we move kids out of that regular mainstream classroom is because their disability requires a level of services that we can't provide there. So the only reason you would ever use tool number 3 is there's behavior that is a manifestation of disability. And like any change of placement, it can be done the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is the parents are totally on board with it. The hard way is they're not. And if they're not, then the school needs to be prepared to defend its decision in a due process hearing. Okay? So, how to think about it? I think first of all, you need to recognize that moving a student to a more restrictive environment, if the school initiates that, if the school is the one that contacts the parent and says, we think Jacob needs to be in the resource room a little bit more. That's an admission of failure on the part of the school, okay? You get that? Where are we supposed to serve Jacob? Least restrictive environment. So when we say, that's not working, we need to go to a more restrictive environment, it's an admission of failure. And what I would encourage you to recognize is that is okay. That is not a bad thing. Failure becomes a legal problem when we deny it, ignore it, or disguise it. If we own up to it and call for a change, then we're doing exactly what the law expects of us. So for the school to say, it's November, we think we've given this a good shot, it's not working, let's consider some alternatives. Nothing wrong with that. But here's the 2 things we have to prove. We have to prove that we've made a good faith, consistent effort to enable that student to succeed in the least restrictive environment. So I asked a principal about that one time. I said, have you tried inclusion? She said, yes, we tried it last Thursday. It did not work. I said, well, I don't think that's going to qualify as a good faith, consistent effort. So, how long is a good faith, consistent effort? I don't know. This is an educational judgment call. But you have to convince a hearing officer that you didn't give up too soon on this student, that when, the meeting to change placement should not be the first time that the parent hears from us. The parent should be informed earlier than that. We're having some problems. Let's talk about it. So good faith, consistent efforts to enable the students to succeed. And then here's the other thing you have to show. You have to be prepared to show, well, how's this going to benefit this kid? What can you do in your more restrictive environment that you can't do in that regular classroom? And why? I've spent my entire career representing school districts in these cases. And anytime you're always on one side of a legal issue, you think about how you'd handle it if you were on the other side. And if I were representing a family in a case like this, You always go into a due process hearing, both sides have a narrative, a story, and they're trying to convince the hearing officer that their story is the more accurate one. And if I'm representing the family, you know what my story's going to be? My story's going to focus on this. I'm going to say, you know what? They're just giving up on Jacob. Jacob is a difficult kid. And the teacher's frustrated, and the teacher's burned out, and the principal's had it, and the rest of the kids are complaining, and the school district's just tired of it, and they are ready to sacrifice Jacob for the benefit of the rest of the class. And they're just going to put him over here in this program. They're not going to do anything with him. They're going to pass him from one grade to the next until he gets out of here. That's going to be my narrative. And you need to be prepared for that. You need to be prepared as a school district to say, no, that is not what we intend. We have a plan to serve the student appropriately, and our plan involves getting him back to the regular school as soon as we can. So those are the things you have to be prepared to convince the hearing officer are true, okay? So tool number 3, you need a strong unit that is more restrictive, maybe self-contained, evidence of your good faith, consistent efforts to implement the IEP in the least restrictive environment, current evaluation data, input from the teachers, and you need that clear description of what is it you can do over there that you can't do here, and why can't you do it in the regular classroom. There's lots of court cases about this where school districts have sought change of placement over parental objection. So the other thing is you need a legal review in advance, and this is where you ask the 3 questions. So the 3 questions that you want to ask before you let the IEP meeting finish in a non-consensus situation. So I really think that school districts can always guarantee that the IEP team will end in consensus. I mean, you can just say we're just going to agree to whatever's proposed. We're okay. If you expect the meeting to end in non-consensus, then you need to ask these 3 questions. Here's first question: is it worth fighting over? Special education legal fights are costly in every sense of the word. You pay your lawyer, and if I read the Indiana rules right, you pay the hearing officer also. Doesn't work that way in Texas. In Texas, the state pays the hearing officer, but in Indiana, the school district pays its lawyer, and it pays the hearing officer, and it probably pays the court reporter, and that's just the financial cost. There's cost to the relationship with the parents. There's cost in terms of stress and focus of the teaching staff and the special education department. One special ed due process hearing can consume your energy for an entire school year. So you really need to think clearly, is this worth fighting over? Or is this something that we really need to get creative and find some way that we can work our way to consensus on this? Is it worth fighting over? Number 2, are we legally defensible? It's going to be a legal fight. So get with your school district attorney. I don't know a lot of lawyers here in Indiana. I know Andrew Manna. He's a friend of mine. I know him from working with the Council of School Attorneys. He's very well respected around the country. Get with a lawyer who knows something about school law, Seamus Boyce is another one I know here. And there was a lawyer who used to work here named Marge, and I can't remember her last name, but she was... who? Who? Okay. Marge. We always call her Marge. She was a Midwesterner. Marge, what do you think, Marge? So are we legally defensible? So call somebody who knows something about special ed law. It's a specialty. And, there are lawyers who know what they're doing. There's very good lawyers who don't have a clue what they're doing in special ed. Get somebody who's done this before. And when I say, are we legally defensible, your lawyer is going to have to invest some time, and that means you're going to have to invest some money before that question can be answered. I can't answer that question based on a 30-minute conversation with you. I got to look over your records, and I don't mean just the last case conference committee. I got to look over the records from at least the past 2 years, because all of that is likely to come up. And so, are we legally defensible? So get a lawyer who knows what they're doing to look over the records and give you an assessment. I think you're providing a free, appropriate public education. I think I can defend this case. So those are the first 2 questions. Now, by the way, those 2 questions are not unique to special ed. If you're a school administrator, you're going to have the opportunity to ask these 2 questions about a wide variety of things. personnel decisions, disputes with parents over other things, dress code, transgender students. You're going to have wonderful opportunities to ask these 2 questions about lots of stuff. The third question in my 3 is limited to special ed. Are we united on this? You know, if you're making a personnel decision, it's not important if the teachers agree with you. It's nice if they do, but it's not legally significant. If you're dealing with a transgender student and you make your best call about that as principal or as superintendent, you don't have to have consensus with the teachers about that. But special ed, if we're not united on this, then we're not legally defensible. So I like to ask the questions from the bottom up. I start with the third question, and if we're not united, then we're not legally defensible, and if we're not legally defensible, I don't think it's worth fighting over. So I kind of go from the bottom up. Now, what do I mean by united? I mean that every person who works directly with that student is going to testify with their hand on the Bible that I think we're doing right by this kid. And in a nutshell, that's what I'm looking for. Who are the most important witnesses in this type of litigation? Whoever has spent the most time in the classroom with the child. The person who, you know, your school psychologist is a wonderful resource, but she is not the main witness. Your special ed director really has probably very little to say about it in terms of testimony. Who's a hearing officer want to hear from? Teacher? Teacher aide, by the way? Anybody who's been in that classroom with the student. Parent, obviously, but the parent can't give us much testimony about what's going on in the school. So that's who we want to get. So, well, you know, what I tell principals is you need to be the leader of your case conference committee, but you're not the quarterback. You don't call the play and dictate it to the rest of the team. You're the leader, and that means you listen to the rest of the team and then you call the play. And so, are we united? So those are the 3 questions we want to ask, okay? All right. All right, let's talk about expedited hearing. Now, this one is used very infrequently. And let me take you back to the case I told you about from San Francisco that went before the Supreme Court. You remember what that was about? We have high school boys with an emotional disturbance, and they're dangerous, and the superintendent is genuinely afraid that if we keep them where they are, pursuant to the stay put rule, somebody's going to get hurt. And so the Supreme Court said, well, superintendent, you don't have the unilateral authority. What you do have now, though, is tool number 4. And what tool number 4 is designed to do is exactly that situation. When there's a stay put situation going on, and the school is afraid that, well, if this kid stays where she is, she's going to hurt somebody. You can't act unilaterally. You can ask for a hearing, expedited hearing. So that's what tool 4 is. So here's what the regulation says. If the school believes that maintaining the current placement of the child is substantially likely to result in an injury to the child or others, it can appeal the decision. Now, what decision are they talking about? They're talking about the manifestation, basically. So the case conference committee has met. The conference committee says the behavior is a manifestation of disability. And so therefore the student stays where the student was. And our principal says, well, I'm really not okay with that. That kid's going to hurt somebody next week. Well, we ask for a hearing. You can go to court in your county, or you can go to a special education hearing officer. But you got to go outside the district. When I say request a hearing, I don't mean in front of the superintendent or the board. I mean you ask for a hearing from somebody else. And here's what happens. The IEP team concludes the behavior is a manifestation. Now remember, I showed you that slide earlier that says when the IEP team says it's a manifestation, what's supposed to happen with the kid? They go right back to where they were. Remember, there were 2 exceptions? Well, one of the exceptions was tool number 2, but that's dependent on parent agreement. They don't agree. The other exception is tool number 5. We're going to get to that in just a minute. We don't have that. So the kid is supposed to go right back where he was. Return to the current placement. School administration thinks this is imminently dangerous. We can't act unilaterally. We can ask for a due process hearing. But we got to prove that somebody is substantially likely to get hurt. Okay? So here's the dilemma for the lawyer. You know, I go to court and I say, Your Honor, I represent the school district, and under the law, this student is supposed to remain in the regular classroom at Franklin D. Roosevelt High School, and I'm telling you, Your Honor, if we do that, some kid in that school is going to get hurt very soon. Well, the judge is going to ask me some questions about that. Counsel, why do you think that? Well, I just do, Your Honor. That's what I think. How do you think that's going to work? My assistant principal's been there for 15 years. He has great intuition. He tells me this kid's going to hurt somebody. Do you think that's going to work? I don't think so. What kind of evidence is the judge going to expect you to present? Somebody already got hurt. I don't think you have a prayer of getting the result you want with tool number 4 unless you have evidence that somebody already got hurt. I want to be able to say, well, Your Honor, last week he did this, and the week before he did that. And there are several reported court cases where schools have obtained this type of relief, and it's all based upon typically a pattern of pretty violent, disruptive behavior by kids. If you don't have that, I don't think you have a chance of getting what you want with tool number 4. So the thing here is, if somebody already got hurt, then maybe we could use tool number 5 instead of tool number 4. If the injury was serious or if a weapon was used. So I need to move on to tool number 5. I keep teasing you about tool number 5. Let's get to it. So on tool 4, you need a convincing case that maintaining the current placement is very likely to cause injury. The behavior is a manifestation. We tried to get the parents to agree. They won't. We don't have special circumstances. We get the lawyer involved and say, go see if you can get this court order. So it's very rare. And I think one reason it's very rare is because usually the circumstances that would allow you to use tool 4 are the same circumstances that would allow you to use tool 5, and tool 5 is a lot simpler. Okay? So let's get to tool 5. Now, by the way, one thing I haven't been doing is talking about whose tool is it. Okay? When I do the all-day toolbox, we emphasize whose tool is it? Who can use the tool? So, quick review. Tool number 1 is a behavior plan. Who writes a behavior plan here in Indiana? CCC, right? So that tool belongs to the CCC. Tool 2 and tool 3 are both changes of placement. Who changes placement? CCC. So those first 3 tools can only be properly operated by your case conference committee. Tool number 4, I call the superintendent's tool, because I don't think your superintendent would be happy with anybody short of the superintendent authorizing the use of tool number 4. It's a pretty aggressive move on the part of the school. The newspapers will report school district sues parent. That's how it's going to come across in the press. I don't think your superintendent's going to be okay with an assistant principal ordering that. So I call tool number 4 the superintendent's tool. This is the principal's tool. Okay? Now remember, the Supreme Court said, what happened to your unilateral authority? Stripped away from you. Okay? Well, tool number 5 gives it back, but only in special circumstances. Now, let me tell you a story that I think illustrates why and how this happened. Our firm represented a school district out in West Texas many years ago that had a real zero-tolerant policy with regard to drug possession. And they had a situation that developed that just sounds like a law school hypothetical. 2 7th grade boys on campus during the school day passing the joint back and forth, possession of marijuana. Guess what? One of the kids is in your special ed program. So regular ed student, special ed student, your turn, my turn. They get caught red-handed. What does a principal want to do here? You know, I know principals pretty well. You know, the main thing they want to do is they want to treat these kids the same. Principals are terrified of being accused of favoritism or some sort of discriminatory treatment. Above all, they don't want to be accused of that. They want to be sure they treat kids did the same thing, they should have the same consequence. The problem is, one of them was in special ed, and we didn't have this special circumstances. So what did they do? The general ed student was given a hearing, found guilty, and expelled from school. Under the law in Texas at that time, he's out. He's just out until next school year. The special ed kid is given a hearing. A manifestation determination was conducted. It was determined that this is not a manifestation of his disability. He was given a hearing. He was expelled, but his parents requested a due process hearing, and under the stay put rule, he comes right back to school. So we got 2 kids who did the same thing. One of them has been expelled. The other one is still attending school. And people in this small town saw what was happening. And they created their explanations for what it was. You know what they noticed? They said, Johnny is in school. His friend Jose is not. Now, what does that sound like? You know, people inferred from that. Well, you tell me the Anglo kid is in school and the Hispanic kid, didn't they pass the joint back and forth? What is this about? It just sounds like racism. And the school couldn't very well explain its position without violating FERPA, right? They couldn't put a notice in the newspaper that says Johnny's got a learning disability, bless his heart, you know? We can't do that. So I think Congress heard enough stories like that that they said, okay, all right, we're going to create some special circumstances. And so these 3 special circumstances are cases where the principal can unilaterally order the removal for up to 45 school days. 45 school days, that's a long time. That's 9 weeks of school, okay? But it's got to be one of the big 3. So, and the removal is to an IAES. It's an interim alternative educational setting. Do you have one of those? You need one. And you can do it without regard to the manifestation. That's what makes it special. Weapons, drugs, serious bodily injury. So let's dive into the definitions just a little bit. Oh, I'm not sure. Do I have the definitions on the... Yeah. The definitions of drugs does not include alcohol. I think that's important. So you have a student who brings a 6-pack of beer to the football game tomorrow night. That violates your code of conduct. Special ed kid, can you take disciplinary action? Sure, but you don't have... I don't think you have special circumstances. It says drugs. Notice also that it says possession, sale, use of drugs. It doesn't say at school. It doesn't say being under the influence of drugs. So you have a student who eats a marijuana brownie every morning for breakfast and comes to school very happy. But she doesn't have it with her. She's not using it at school. She's not possessing it at school. I don't think you have special circumstances. So I don't think it includes alcohol. I don't think it includes under the influence. Serious bodily injury. Here's the definition, pretty vague. Now, most of the court cases we see are about extreme physical pain. And that is a subjective thing, you know. Our firm is looking to see if we can get a patent on an educator pain-o-meter so that we'd get some objective reading on this, you know. I think there's a market for that. Anybody here had a broken nose? Anybody here had a broken nose? You did? How bad did it hurt? Pretty bad. Can you put it on a scale of 1 to 10?
When it happened, it was probably a 9.
A 9? Okay. Let me suggest to you that in order to qualify as a serious bodily injury, it has to be a 10. So I want you to reflect again on what that was like at the moment of impact. It was a 10. I thought you'd say that. Okay. We've actually had a couple of hearing officers that said, we don't think a broken nose is bad enough. And I'm like, what? But yeah, we've had that. There's a whole bunch of these cases about what's bad enough and what's not bad enough. It's a bizarre area of the law. There's probably experts on serious bodily injury law. But one of the ones that I thought was kind of interesting is there's a teacher in California who claimed that she suffered the worst pain of her life. Now, what was it? A 6-year-old headbutted her and kicked her in the chest. I don't mean to minimize it. But she said that's the worst pain of her life. And I want to say, lady, you obviously have not experienced childbirth, all right? Because I have witnessed that thing. And, you know, if men had to do that, this just be the end of things. We wouldn't do it. That would be the end, you know? So, broken nose. A couple of hearing officers say no. So, you know, I like to joke about serious bodily injury. I realize it's not a joking matter. Here's a shorthand explanation for what I would suggest to you. If you didn't call 911 right away, I don't think you have a serious bodily injury. So most of what happens in the school, I know teachers get hurt. And other students, by the way, serious bodily injury does not have to be inflicted on a teacher. It could be on a fellow student. And some of the cases are about that. And I know that lots of stuff happens. But most of it is not going to come anywhere close to serious bodily injury. If you had to go home for the day and then you came back the next day and you did put in your full day work, I don't think you've suffered a serious bodily injury. If Congress took the word serious off of the law, principals would be using this every day. And that's why Congress is not going to do that. Remember, let's look at the history of this. First, they took away your authority completely, and then they said, okay, there's some serious offenses, we'll give it back to you. So they let the rope out a little bit, but they don't want to turn principals completely wild on this. So it's got to be a serious bodily injury, okay? Sometimes what I tell people about tool number 5 is it can help you avoid an argument. I had a situation where the student brought a knife to school. And the knife had a blade that was long enough to qualify as a dangerous weapon under this statute. The mother, however, she was one of the, remember I told you about the MSPs, the more sophisticated parents? She was one of those, and she was claiming that he has the I bring a knife to school disability, and she was going to tie us up in litigation for the next decade. And she had the means to do that. So I get a call from the principal. I said, what were you trying to do? She said, I want to put him in that DAEP, that discipline program. I said, how long? She said, the rest of the year. How many days are left in the year? 20. I said, well, you can do it. She said, well, Mom says it's a manifestation. I said, go back to Mom and say the magic words. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. Maybe it is a manifest. Maybe he did bring the knife to school because of his speech impairment. Maybe he did. But what we agree on is he brought a knife to school, and I have the authority to use tool number 5. Your kid's going to the alternative ed. So sometimes you can use it to avoid an argument, So you need evidence of the offense, you need due process, you need to know how your code of conduct would address this. For example, this thing says if you have a knife with a blade of more than 2.5 inches, it's a dangerous weapon. I will tell you, there's a lot of schools in Texas that don't consider that to be all that dangerous. They don't. I mean, especially if the student hasn't threatened anybody with it, the student hasn't used it, it's just in the backpack. Most schools are not going to they're not going to send that kid off for 45 days. They may not do much of anything. And so the first question is always, what would you do if this were a general ed student that did the same thing? We don't want to punish our special ed kids more than that. So keep that in mind, okay? Now you do have to have a case conference committee with Tool 5. You do have to make a manifestation determination. It's just that the outcome of that is not going to drive the placement of the student. So why are you doing a manifestation? I think it informs the behavior plan. Let's take that knife example. We have the student who brought a knife to school, and we have to have manifestation. And we say, we don't think that has anything to do with disability. But let's explore a little bit more. Why did the student bring a knife to school? Well, she's been bullied for the past 6 weeks. And she brought the knife for her own protection. Well, does that have do we maybe need to take that into account in terms of her IEP and her behavior plan? I think so. So the manifestation can be helpful, okay? You have to give the parent the procedural safeguard document. All right. Now, tool number 6 is a good old-fashioned disciplinary change of placement. We don't have a lot to say about this. The school can propose disciplinary action that is in excess of 10 consecutive school days. I assume you would only do this for fairly serious student misconduct. Am I right about that? So the student's done something we think is pretty serious violation of our code of conduct. We're going to propose disciplinary action in excess of 10 consecutive school days. We can only do this if the student has violated the code of conduct. We have to have equal treatment with the non-disabled student. In other words, if it were a non-disabled student did the same behavior, this is what we would do. So, and it must not be a manifestation of disability. So, the manifestation is just a fancy name for making sure that we're not punishing a kid for having a disability. You wouldn't want to punish a student because he's deaf. So don't punish him for behavior that arises directly from the deafness. And do we have to do a manifestation on all disabilities? Yes. This is not just about the ED kids and the kids with autism, but you're going to see more behaviors that are manifestations with those kids. But you have to do the manifestation with everybody. So the process is school officials determine the student violated the code of conduct, and then the IEP team conducts the manifestation determination, or the CCC. Now, I recommend you do it, and if the behavior is not a manifestation, the removal occurs, but we have to continue to figure out a way to continue to provide appropriate services. So just go home and we'll see you next year. That's not an option. You have to figure out a way to how are you going to continue to enable the student to make progress on that IEP. So here's what the regulation says. It says for disciplinary changes of placement, if the behavior that gave rise to the violation is determined not to be a manifestation, then school personnel may apply the relevant discipline procedures in the same manner for the same duration. There's no 45-day cap on this one. It's same manner, same duration. So in other words, if the student's behavior is not a manifestation of disability, they should be held accountable exactly the way the general ed student is. So this is not, the manifestation was never intended to be a loophole for kids not to be held accountable. It's a check on discrimination. That's what it's about, okay? And it says that there's an except, the good old law always has an except in it. Except as provided in this paragraph, and that paragraph is the one that says, well, you still have to provide free appropriate public ed, okay? So, no expulsion to the street. So it's a two-step process, general ed due process, IEP team action after that. Best practice is to do it in that order. That gives the IEP team more information about what really happened here and allows the parent to have adequate time to prepare for the meeting. Okay. So tool 6, you need evidence of the offense, you need due process for the students, you need to know how the code of conduct would address this type of thing, notice of procedural safeguards to the parent, and a quality program that can continue to provide a free appropriate public education. And a timely notice of the meeting. All right, tool 7. Now this is the FAPE-free zone. And I would like for you all to say FAPE-free zone on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
FAPE-free zone.
Very good, thank you. See, I take some pride in this term. I claim credit for it. I believe I invented it. Actually, I should give proper credit. I think it's divinely inspired, but it was me that was inspired. I was driving down the road one day, thinking about special ed law like I normally am, and God spoke to me. And God said, you are making a mess of this 10-day business. You're doing training from Amarillo to Beaumont, and you get principals all confused about this. They keep asking you the same questions, same ones you just asked. Do I get another 10 days? Does the clock start over? You never answered that question the same way twice, and you've made a mess of it. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? And God said, give it a name. I said, give what a name? And he said, the first 10 days, give it a name to distinguish it from everything else. That'll help. So I said, okay, and I thought about it. I drove about another 15 miles down the road and gave some thought to that, and I said, what do you think about FAPE-free zone? And the Lord God Almighty said, it is good. Just like Genesis, it is good. So that's kind of my story. It kind of happened that way. And but I'm in the 8th inning of my career, and you start thinking about legacy. And if I get that in a court case with a footnote and my name, it's there forever, So that's why I wanted you to repeat FAPE-free zone. Now, what is it? It's the 10 days, okay? And the 10 days are like your birthday. It's once a year, all right? And you can use it up in one fell swoop, and you can use it up in short-term things that add up to 10. But it's 10 days, and it's not going to be repeated, okay? So and this is, again, the Supreme Court said, Congress took your unilateral power away from you, except for the 10 days. We'll give you that. So it's not a denial of FAPE to fail to serve a student for 10 school days cumulatively through the school year. No services are required as long as you're treating them like the non-disabled students are treated the same. So it's pretty simple. The only thing complicated about tool number 7 is what days do you count? All right? And we don't have time to go into this in great detail. Short explanation. If the student's been dismissed for the day, if you send him home, you got to count it. And I've heard principals get pretty creative about that. Did you suspend the student? Oh, no. I just called the parents and said, come get him. I think you got to count that, all right? Did you suspend the student? No, I put him on administrative leave. You got to count that. Do you have to count ISS, in-school suspension? It's not clear. Is it clear in Indiana? He says yes, she says no. I'm getting confusion. I get it everywhere I go. Do you count ISS? I don't know, but y'all need to talk about it. And be clear about it. The worst mistake you can make with ISS is let the principal think that it doesn't count when the special ed department thinks it does. So please don't hold back from each other. Talk about, are we counting this or are we not? Need to talk about that. I think Julie tomorrow is going to talk about this in a little more detail. We don't have time, but 10 days when it's gone, it's gone. I had a school call me and they said, you know, we're getting to the last 10 days of the school year, and they said, we have a special ed student, has perfect attendance all year and has perfect behavior, and we never used any of our FAPE-free days. Can we just send that kid home for the last 10 days? I said, no, I don't think this is vacation time. This is for you to use as principal, okay? All right. So on tool number 7, you just need to know how many days have already been used. You need to know the answer to that question. Are we counting in-school suspension or not? All right, tool 8. Now, tool 8 is the most complicated part of this. So it's unfortunate we get to it kind of late in the day, but bear with me now. So let me lay the groundwork for this. Here are the questions I get from principals. Do I get another 10 days? Whoops, do I get another 10 days? Does the clock start over? Can we create a FAPE-free zone bank? I thought that was a good one. They said, what do you mean a bank? They said, well, like our sick leave bank, you know? We have kids that never use their FAPE-free days. We have other kids who need more. Can't we just do some bookkeeping? No. All right. So I'm going to surprise you. I think you're going to be surprised with my answer to the first question, because I just told that lady you don't get another 10 days. Now listen carefully. Do I get another 10 days? Yeah. It's just that they're not FAPE-free. This is why God told me to give it a name. You do get another 10 days. You always have 10 days in your back pocket, principals. But only the first 10 are FAPE-free. And that has some real practical implications for how you use them and when you use them. Out of school suspension is not an option when you've used up your FAPE-free zone. Not an option. In-school suspension might be good. Removal to a more restrictive environment might be good. Out of school suspension, forget about it. I'm going to hold off on questions till the end because I'm running a little short on time here. You do get another 10 days. They're not FAPE-free, and you can't do it unilaterally. Remember, unilateral, 10 days. That's all. So principals can do this, but they need some help to do it. So here's the deal. Here's what the law says. Now, this one, again, I'm showing you the exact quote from the law, so I don't want to be accused of paraphrasing. Notice the first two words, school personnel. That's significant. It doesn't say case conference committee. It doesn't say IEP team can do this. It says school personnel. Well, who are they talking about? Talking about our principal. School personnel may remove a child with a disability who violates a code of student conduct for not more than 10 consecutive school days. Let's just stop right there for a second. Just stop right there. Do you see that the first part of this regulation is talking about what we just described as tool number 7? You see that? That's the first 10 days. Okay? So this is the regulation that gives you your 10 days, but it's not the end of the regulation. And for an additional removal of not more than 10 days in the same school year for a separate incident of misconduct. So do I get another 10 days? Yeah, it says so right there. But a couple of things about this. I have to make sure that this second removal is not going to create a change of placement. And I have to get somebody to help me with this one, because I can't do it unilaterally. And I have to provide services to the kid, because it's not FAPE-free. So tool 8, quite different from tool 7. Okay? So here's where it says we have to provide services. It says after a child with a disability has been removed from the current placement for 10 school days in the same school year. Let's pause right there. Pause right there. Do you see that what that effectively is saying is after the FAPE-free zone? You see the benefit of my toolbox terminology? We could say this a lot simpler. If we just said after the FAPE-free zone, during any subsequent days of removal, well, apparently we can have subsequent days of removal. During any subsequent day of removal, we have to provide services. So do I get another 10 days? Yeah, but they're different. And we have to provide services. And here's the standard. We have to provide enough services to enable the child to continue to participate in the general curriculum and make progress toward meeting those IEP goals. So we don't back off on the IEP goals. And we have to continue to provide sufficient services to enable the student to make progress on that, okay? So there are more days, they're just not FAPE-free. So here's the limits on tool number 8. Subsequent days of removal have to be accompanied by services. They're not FAPE-free. The principal has to consult with the teacher. Here's the part about not being unilateral. Tool 7, principal doesn't have to consult with anybody. She can just tell her husband about it that night. Honey, I used tool 7 today. That maybe violates FERPA, but that's a whole other thing. Tool 8, I got to get a teacher to sign off on it. That standard of enabling the child to continue to make progress, I can't make that decision unilaterally. I have to get at least one of the child's teachers to agree with me. And you should have a form that accomplishes this. And we have to make sure it's not a change of placement. Now I'm going to show you my one exciting slide. It's the next slide. It's a video. It's from a educational film that we did several years ago, and I need to give you the background on this. In this video, and I'm not in the video, the part I'm going to show you, but I portray Principal D.W. Do-Right. 10 minutes, thank you. And I have been hit in the face with a water balloon thrown by a student with a disability. And I am steaming about this. I'm going full Ed Rooney. And I'm gonna, do y'all remember Ed Rooney? All right, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I'm gonna get this kid. And so what happens right before the part I'm gonna show you is Mr. Do-Right is looking into the camera and he says, I'm gonna suspend this kid for 3 weeks. I'm gonna get him, by God. And then I look into the camera and I say, now wait a minute, don't I have to do something legal this time?
Yes, Mr. Do-Right, you do need to do something legal this time. Dickie is about to be suspended for 3 weeks for hitting the principal with a water balloon. Since Dickie is a student with a disability, this is what the law refers to as a change in placement. First, check state law to make sure a suspension of that length is permitted. Second, comply with the change in placement procedures required under federal law. Basically, there are 2 times the law recognizes a disciplinary change in placement. 1. Disciplinary removal for more than 10 consecutive school days. 2. A series of removals that constitute a pattern because the removals total more than 10 school days in 1 school year, the child's behavior is substantially similar to the behavior that resulted in the previous removals, and additional factors such as the length of each removal, the total amount of time the child has been removed, and the proximity of the removals.
In Dickie's case, it's pretty simple. Principal Do-Right has charged Dickie with the violation of the Code of Conduct and has proposed removing Dickie from the placement called for in his IEP. The proposed removal is for more than 10 consecutive days. Yep, we got ourselves a change in placement here. We need to have a meeting to do a manifestation determination.
In cases of short-term removals that add up to more than 10 days, it's a bit more confusing. You have to have a pattern. For one thing, that means you have to have more than 10 days of removal, even though they are not consecutive. So, somebody has to be counting the days.
But for it to be a pattern, the removals have to be for behaviors that are substantially similar.
And for it to be a pattern, you have to factor in the proximity of the removals from one another. And if they are bunched up in time,
For substantially similar behaviors and
Add up to more than 10.
you have a change in placement.
So I hope you get what we're doing with the blocks. There's more than 10. Each one represents 1 day. There's more than 10. Then we got them all yellow. Behaviors are similar. And then we punched them together. They have to be somewhat close in time. So, this is too much to take in late in the day. Let me tell you but here's the definition. And I like to, as a practical matter, I don't pay too much attention to this factor, similar behavior. And the reason I don't is I don't have the slightest idea what that means. And, I can find a psychologist very easily that will take 5 different behaviors that sound like they're very different, and a good psychologist will be able to quickly explain how they're really very similar at their root cause. You know what I mean? I don't want to get into an argument over similar behaviors. So I kind of focus on these 2, more than 10 days within proximity. And what I would look at, and Julie's got some examples in her materials tomorrow that'll show this, but you might want to consider giving that term proximity some definition. Like you might say in your district that we consider more than 10 days of removal within a 90-day window. We think that would be a pattern, all right? In other words, this makes sense if you think about it. Let's assume a student is suspended several times, 3 days at a crack, all right? If those things happen in September, October, November, and December, then before you get to Christmas, you've already missed 12 days of school. That's a significant amount of school you've missed. But what if it was September, December, March, and May? If you have my definition, you've not changed that student's, that's not a pattern, because you never had more than 10 within a 90-day window, okay? So that's how that works, okay? So I'm gonna skip over that. Here's really the main time I would encourage you to consider using tool number 8. It's February 2nd, happens to be Groundhog Day. Jason's FAPE pre-zone is gone. He's used, all 10 days have been used up. That's the day when he assaults a teacher. Now I chose that because I think we would all agree that's pretty serious misconduct. We contact the police. It's catch and release week at the police department. So he's right, you know, they're going to charge him, but he's right back at school. And our 10 days are gone. Now we have to have a manifestation meeting, right? And I bumped into a lot of principals that have said, well, we're having that meeting tomorrow. Why? Because I don't have any more days, and I don't want this kid coming back on my campus. My teachers will give me hell if this student shows up on campus after beating up one of our teachers. We're having that IEP meeting tomorrow. The problem with that is that parent is entitled to notice of that meeting 5 days in advance of the meeting. There's another problem. Your staff is not ready to do that manifestation yet. So I think you got to buy yourself some time. Now here's the deal. There is a deadline for conducting the manifestation. It's 10 school days. So in this example, that 10 school days begins to run on February 2nd. 10 school days is usually 14 calendar days, right? So we have until February the 16th to do our manifestation. And the principal says, okay, but I don't have any more FAPE-free days. What am I going to do? Tool number 8. Tool number 8. I'm going to assign him. And you notice I put this in all caps. Principals don't place kids. Who places kids? CCC. I can assign. I can assign. Pending the until we have the IEP meeting, Jason is assigned as follows. And I'm going to assign him to in-school suspension or something where he will continue to receive services, but he's not going back to his regular classroom. And this gives my IEP team time to prepare for this manifestation, and it gives parents time to prepare for the manifestation. So that would be the most common example I would suggest where tool number 8 is useful. I have another 10 days, but they're not FAPE-free, so I can assign Jason somewhere where he will continue to get appropriate services, okay? So, all right. Now, I do want to provide just at least a few minutes. Oh, we're about out of time. Tool number 9 is leadership at the non-consensus IEP team meeting. And really, I don't need to say a whole lot about this. We've talked about it quite a bit. But you can come to closure without consensus. You know, the case conference committee is not a war of attrition to see who is willing to sit in an uncomfortable chair longer. It's supposed to come to closure. You know, and I'm in favor of you all putting a timeline on your IEP meetings. You know, the regulations say that an IEP meeting is supposed to be at a mutually agreeable time and place. Mutually agreeable can apply not just to when it starts, but when it finishes. And I'm in favor of starting a meeting with some ground rules, including, can we all agree that we're going to try to get our business done in about an hour and a half? You can do that. You got to get parental buy-in on that. But most parents don't want to be there for 5 hours either. So, and if you're not going to come to consensus, somebody needs to call it. Somebody needs to say, you know, Mr. Walsh, we've had a good discussion here. It's pretty clear to me that we're not going to be able to come to consensus. We think your child is not eligible for special ed, and you think he is. So let's bring our meeting to closure and talk about where we go from there. That's what I mean by leadership at the non-consensus meeting. And the parent needs to understand what their rights are at that time. Let's go over that procedural safeguard document. Let's make sure the parent knows that they can challenge our decision. All right. When the team fails to come to consensus, the school is supposed to take the action that it deems appropriate. Now, that is what the regulations tell us, that's what the court cases tell us. So we give prior written notice to the parent, here's where we stand, and this is what will go into effect. And the parent can challenge that decision by requesting a due process hearing. And remember, there's only two parties at a meeting. There's the parent and there's the school. Or there's the adult student in the school. You may have a dozen people there, but you only have two parties. And that means you might come to a tie vote. So the best analogy for your case conference committee is your marriage, because your marriage also typically has two parties, and there's going to be a tie vote from time to time. And so if you want your marriage to last, I've been married to the same woman for 46 years without a furlough in there at all. And we've had some tie votes over the years. And I have found that you have to have a good way of resolving the tie vote. So this is where those three questions come in again on tool number 9. So we don't need to say much about tool number 10 other than you have the right to call the cops. I hope you don't have to. But you have the right to call the police. In fact, I don't know about Indiana law. In Texas, there are certain things for which the principal is required to call the police. Do you all have that? Certain assault, weapons, drugs, some of these we have to call the cops. So you have this authority. The Office of Special Ed and Rehabilitative Services noted that in their Q&A. Schools have been getting criticism for overuse of police. But I really think that criticism is in the context of minor offenses. You know, let's not be ticketing kids for the F word. Let's not be creating criminal records for kids for Mickey Mouse offenses. But that's not what we're talking about here today. We're talking about more serious misconduct. Nobody questions the authority of the school to seek out law enforcement assistance on that. You do have to send the records for consideration by the authorities, but that has to be done in conformity with FERPA. So you don't just automatically turn records over to law enforcement. You ask, do you have a subpoena? Do you have a court order? Or do we have parental consent? And really, I think we do that when they're going to keep the child in custody for a while. That's typically when you would do that, okay? So remember, on the toolbox, and we have gone through in a fast hour and a half what we spend all day on, and we have a book and so on, and we have hypotheticals. If tool number 1 works, you don't need the other 9. So you want to focus on that, crafting and monitoring good, strong behavior plans. You want to have alternative programs and more restrictive environments that are good and that focus on improved behavior. You want to lobby the leaders of your district to create good, strong, quality IAES, interim alternative educational settings. And there you have it, okay? So that's the toolbox. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.